The shook hard as it cut through the thick brown clouds of. Inside, 32 cadets sat in rows of metal seats, their harnesses holding them tight against the turbulence. Most of them looked calm. They were trained soldiers from across the galaxy, selected from hundreds of applicants to attend the Galactic Military Academy. They had survived tests of strength, speed, and intelligence. They had proven themselves worthy. But this was different. This was the Sandstorm trial. Cadet sat at the end of the second row, her back straight and her hands resting on her knees. She was the only human on the ship. She was also the smallest person in the cabin by a significant margin. The warrior next to her stood over 2 meters tall, with thick blue skin and muscles that looked like they had been carved from stone. He had not looked at her once during the entire flight. Did not mind. She was used to being ignored. The ship's speaker crackled, and the voice of Commandant filled the cabin. The Commandant was not on the ship. She was watching from the orbital station above, monitoring everything through cameras and sensors. Her voice was cold and precise, like a blade being drawn across metal. "Cadets," she said, "you are about to begin the final phase of your first-year evaluation. The Sandstorm trial has been conducted on for over 300 years. It is simple. Survive for 72 hours in the desert. Reach the extraction point before time runs out. Those who fail will be removed from the academy. Those who activate their emergency beacon will be rescued, but they will also fail." The ship shook again, harder this time. Through the small window beside her seat, could see nothing but swirling dust and darkness. It was a desert planet, but it was not like the deserts on Earth. The storms here lasted for days. They carried sand that could strip flesh from bone. They generated electromagnetic fields that destroyed technology and confused sensors. There was no calling for help once you were down there. There was no navigation. There was only the desert and your own ability to survive it. "You have been given standard survival kits," the Commandant continued. "1 thermal blanket, 1 half-liter water container, 1 signal flare, 1 emergency beacon, 1 utility knife. These supplies are identical for all cadets regardless of species. The Academy does not provide advantages." Heard a low rumble of laughter from the cadets across the aisle. They were already looking at each other with knowing expressions. Their species had evolved on a harsh warrior world. They could survive for days without water. Their skin was resistant to heat and cold. The standard kit was more than enough for them. Checked her own kit for the 10th time. Half a liter of water would last her maybe 6 hours in extreme heat. The thermal blanket would help at night, but it would do nothing against the sandstorms. The knife was good quality, but it was small. She had trained with weapons 10 times its size during combat exercises. This was not a combat exercise. This was survival. And humans were not built for survival on alien worlds. That was what everyone at the Academy believed. The ship began its descent. The turbulence grew worse, gripped her harness and waited. The landing was rough. The ship's doors opened with a hiss, and hot, dry air flooded the cabin. It smelled like copper and dust. Unstrapped herself and stood, grabbing her kit and moving toward the exit with the other cadets. Outside, the world was red. The sky was brown and angry, filled with clouds that moved too fast. The ground was covered in fine sand that shifted with every gust of wind. In the distance, could see rock formations rising from the desert like broken teeth. There were no trees. There were no rivers. There was nothing but sand and stone and the promise of a storm that would last 3 days. The cadets spread out quickly, watched the groups form with practiced speed. The 5 warriors gathered together first, their voices low and confident. They were already discussing shelter construction. Their leader, a massive cadet named Sir, was pointing toward a rocky outcrop to the north. His plan was clear. They would use their strength to build a fortified position and wait out the storm together. The cadets gathered next. There were 8 of them, slender beings with pale skin and large dark eyes. They did not speak out loud. They did not need to. Their species was telepathic. They could share thoughts and sensory information across short distances. As watched, they turned as a single unit and began walking east, their movements perfectly synchronized. They were already digging. They were stocky creatures with 4 arms and hard shells covering their backs. Their claws were designed for tunneling. Within minutes, they had created the beginnings of a burrow system in the sandy soil. They did not even look at the other cadets. They had their own way of surviving, and they trusted it completely. Stood alone in the center of the landing zone. The ship was already lifting off behind her, its engines kicking up clouds of dust. She shielded her eyes and watched it disappear into the brown sky. Then she looked around at the dispersing groups. She needed allies. She knew that. Survival was always easier in numbers. Humans had learned that lesson 1,000,000 years ago on Earth. They had conquered their world not through strength or speed, but through cooperation and adaptation, believed in those principles. She had built her entire academy application around them. She approached the first. Sir turned to look at her as she walked up. His eyes were yellow and slitted, like a cat's. His expression was not hostile, but it was not welcoming either. "What do you want, human?" he asked. "I want to join your group," said. She kept her voice calm and direct. "I can help with shelter construction. I have training in structural engineering. I can identify load-bearing points and weak spots." Sir looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You are too small," he said. "You cannot carry stones. You cannot dig foundations. You will slow us down and use resources we cannot spare." He turned away from her. "Find somewhere else to die." The other did not even acknowledge her presence. Stood there for a moment, then nodded once and walked away. She approached the next. They stopped walking as she got close, turning to face her with their dark, unblinking eyes. She could feel something pressing against the edges of her mind. It was not painful, but it was strange. They were trying to read her thoughts. "I would like to join your group," she said. "I know I cannot communicate telepathically, but I can follow verbal commands. I am a fast learner." They looked at each other. No words were spoken, but could tell they were having a conversation. Finally, one of them stepped forward. Her voice was soft and musical, but there was something distant in it. "Your mind is singular," she said. "Isolated. It is like trying to communicate with a stone. We cannot coordinate with you. We cannot sense your intentions or share our perceptions. You would be a vulnerability." "I understand," said. She did not argue. There was no point in arguing with telepaths. "Thank you for your time." She walked toward They were deep in their burrow now, only their upper bodies visible above the sand. She stood at the edge of their excavation and waited. One of them looked up at her. His face was flat and expressionless, his eyes small and black. "Human," he said, "you have no claws, you have no shell, you cannot help us dig, you cannot help us survive. Go away." He went back to digging, without waiting for a response. Stood alone on the desert plain. The wind was picking up. She could feel sand beginning to sting her exposed skin. In the distance, she could see the first dark wall of the incoming storm. It looked like a mountain made of dust and fury. It looked like the end of the world. She had 3 days to survive. She had half a liter of water. She had no allies. She had no special abilities. She was just a human, standing alone on an alien world that wanted her dead. Took a deep breath, then she started walking. She did not walk toward the rock formations where they were heading. She did not walk east She walked south, toward a cluster of strange shapes she had noticed during the descent. They were not rocks. They were not buildings. They were something else. The briefing materials had mentioned them briefly. Local flora, non-nutritive, not dangerous. The Academy had deemed them irrelevant to the trial. Had learned long ago that irrelevant things were often the most important things of all. The storm hit before she reached the shapes. The wind became a roar. The sand became a weapon, pulled her thermal blanket from her kit and wrapped it around her head and shoulders, creating a crude shield against the cutting particles. She could barely see 5 meters ahead. She stumbled forward, one step at a time, her eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes growing slowly larger through the dust. They were plants, massive barrel-shaped cacti, some of them nearly 4 meters tall. Their surfaces were covered in thick spines and waxy skin. They stood in clusters, their fat bodies swaying slightly in the wind but holding firm against the storm. Reached the nearest one and pressed her hand against its surface. It was cool and slightly damp. She could feel moisture beneath the thick outer layer. She looked at the cactus. She looked at her knife. She looked at the storm raging around her. Then she started cutting. Part 2. The storm grew worse as the hours passed. On the orbital station above, Commandant stood before a massive display screen, watching 32 blinking lights spread across a map of the desert. Each light represented a cadet. Each cadet represented years of training and enormous investment from their home worlds. Within 6 hours, 5 lights had turned red. Failed. The cadets had activated their emergency beacons and been extracted by automated rescue drones. Within 12 hours, 9 more lights turned red. Wings twitched with irritation. She was in from the hive world of 9, where her species had evolved to survive brutal conditions through perfect cooperation. She had little patience for weakness. The sandstorm trial was designed to separate the capable from the incapable. So far, the results were disappointing. She studied the remaining lights. The group was holding together, clustered around the rock formations to the north. Their shelter construction was impressive. They had used their strength to move heavy stones into defensive walls, creating a windbreak that protected them from the worst of the sandstorm. But 3 of their lights were flashing yellow. That meant injuries. The electromagnetic interference from the storm was disrupting their communication equipment and causing unexpected problems. They were in worse shape. Their telepathic network was faltering. The ionized particles in the storm atmosphere were creating interference that disrupted their mental connections. Instead of moving as a coordinated unit, they were scattered and confused. 2 of them had already failed. The others were walking in circles, unable to navigate. The burrows had been a good idea in theory. Underground shelters would protect against wind and sand. But the storm had brought something unexpected: flash flooding. The bizarre pressure systems created by the electromagnetic storm had shifted weather patterns across the desert, triggering sudden rainfall in areas that had not seen water in decades. The burrows were filling with water and mud. The cadets were being forced to the surface, where they had no other shelter prepared. Compound eyes scanned the display, counting the surviving lights. 18 cadets remained active. No, 17. Another light just turned red. Then she noticed something strange. One light had not moved in 18 hours. It was located to the south, far from any of the other groups, in an area the Academy had marked as low priority. The light belonged to Cadet, the human. Tapped the display, zooming in on the signal. The data was incomplete. The electromagnetic interference was blocking most sensor readings. But the beacon was still transmitting, which meant the cadet was still alive. The lack of movement could mean many things: injury, exhaustion, equipment malfunction, death. The commandant considered her options. Sending a rescue drone would be expensive and potentially dangerous in these storm conditions. If was dead, it would be a waste of resources. If she was alive but incapacitated, she would eventually activate her emergency beacon and fail the trial like the others. But something about the situation bothered. The human had been alone from the beginning. No allies, no special abilities, no advantages. By all logical analysis, she should have been one of the first to fail. Instead, her beacon was still active after 18 hours of the worst storm the planet had seen in years. The commandant made a decision. She dispatched an observation drone. The drone fought through the storm for nearly an hour before reaching its location. Its cameras were partially obscured by sand and dust, but it managed to capture footage before its systems began to fail. What saw made her wings go completely still. The human had found a grove of barrel cacti. That much was expected. The plants were common in the southern regions. What was not expected was what the human had done with them. Had selected a large dead cactus, one that had dried out and begun to decay. Using her utility knife, she had carved a hole in its side, large enough for her body to fit through. Then she had hollowed out the interior, removing the dried, fibrous material and creating a cavity inside the massive plant. She had turned the cactus into a shelter. The drone's cameras showed the details clearly. The thick walls of the cactus blocked the wind completely. Sand could not penetrate the dense, waxy exterior. The electromagnetic interference that was disrupting technology across the desert was being absorbed by the plant's natural structure, creating a small pocket of relative calm inside. But that was not the most remarkable thing. The most remarkable thing was sleeping. She had stripped her thermal blanket into long pieces and woven them into a crude hammock, suspended inside the hollow cactus. She had positioned herself above the ground, away from any moisture or insects that might gather at the bottom. She had collected condensation from the inner walls of the plant, gathering water that had seeped through from the living cacti nearby. Her water container was nearly full. The human was not struggling. She was not suffering. She was not fighting for survival against impossible odds. She was taking a nap. Stared at the footage for a long time. In her 300 years of service, she had seen many things. She had watched cadets from warrior species fight to the death against the desert. She had watched geniuses from technological civilizations build elaborate survival machines that ultimately failed. She had watched telepaths and empaths and beings with abilities beyond human comprehension struggle and suffer and give up. She had never seen anyone sleep through the sandstorm trial. The drone's systems failed shortly after capturing the footage, saved the recording and returned her attention to the main display. More lights were turning red. The had suffered a serious setback. Lightning strikes had hit their metal shelter components, injuring 3 more cadets. The survivors were reorganizing, but their confidence was shaken. The had lost another too. Their telepathic network was completely broken now. They were functioning as individuals, something their species was not designed to do. They were panicking. The had abandoned their burrows entirely. They were huddled on the surface, their shells providing some protection against the sand, but nothing against the cold that came with the night. 2 more failures. By hour 40 of the trial, only 7 lights remained active. By hour 50, only 2. One was Sir, the leader. He had retreated to a cave system when his shelter failed, leaving his injured comrades to be rescued by the emergency drones. He was surviving through sheer determination and the natural advantages of his species, but even he was struggling. The cave offered protection from the wind, but not from the cold or the lack of water. His beacon showed minimal movement. He was conserving energy, waiting for the storm to end. The other light was still. She had not moved in 20 hours, but her beacon was still active. Her vital signs, what little the sensors could read through the interference, were stable. More than stable, they were optimal. The human was still sleeping. Did not know what to think. She had studied humans before accepting's application to the academy. She knew their reputation. They were considered a young species, primitive by galactic standards. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago. Their bodies were fragile. They were short. They had no natural weapons, no protective shells, no special abilities. But they had survived their home world. That was what the reports always mentioned. Earth was a dangerous planet. It had deserts and tundras and jungles and oceans. It had predators and parasites and diseases. It had natural disasters that could destroy entire civilizations. And humans had conquered it all. Not through strength, not through technology, not through special abilities. Through adaptation. Looked at the footage again, the hollow cactus, the woven hammock, the collected water. Every element was simple. Every element was obvious in retrospect, but no other cadet had thought of it. The had trusted their strength. The had trusted their telepathy. The had trusted their biology. The human had trusted nothing but her own ability to observe, adapt, and survive. The storm began to weaken on the morning of the 3rd day. The winds died down. The sand settled. The electromagnetic interference faded. Sensors came back online across the desert. Watched as 2 lights began to move. Sir emerged from his cave and began walking toward the extraction point. He was dehydrated and exhausted, his movements slow and painful. But he would not give up. He would reach the finish or die trying. Emerged from her cactus at almost the same time. She stretched her arms above her head, rolled her shoulders, and began walking north. She was not slow. She was not exhausted. She was refreshed. The commandant leaned forward, her compound eyes fixed on the human's beacon as it moved steadily across the map. She had water. She had energy. She had somehow managed to rest while the most brutal storm in years raged around her. The extraction point was 60 kilometers away. Sir had a head start. He was moving at a steady pace despite his condition. Was moving faster. Settled back to watch. For the first time in many years, she was genuinely curious about the outcome. Part 3. The sun rose over like a wound opening in the sky. The desert stretched out in all directions, vast and silent after 3 days of chaos. Sand dunes had shifted. Rock formations had been scoured smooth. The landscape looked different than it had when the trial began, reshaped by the storm into something new and strange. Walked through this transformed world with steady steps. Her boots had been damaged by sand during the initial hours of the trial, the material worn thin in places and threatening to fall apart. She had solved this problem during her time in the cactus shelter. Using fibers stripped from the plant's interior, she had woven crude sandals that fit over her boots, providing an extra layer of protection. They were not beautiful, they were not comfortable, but they worked. That was what mattered, things that worked. She had water remaining in her container. Not much, but enough. The condensation she had collected inside the cactus had been a pleasant surprise. The dead plant she had chosen for shelter was positioned next to several living ones, and moisture had seeped through the ground between them. Every few hours, she had been able to gather small amounts of water from the inner walls of her shelter. It was not clean. It tasted like dust and plant fiber, but it was liquid, and it kept her alive. She had also slept. That was the part she was most grateful for. Sleep was something most species took for granted. They thought of it as a weakness, a period of vulnerability when predators could attack and opportunities could be missed. But knew better. Sleep was when the body repaired itself. Sleep was when the mind processed information and prepared for the challenges ahead. Sleep was not a weakness. It was a weapon. The other cadets had not slept. She was certain of that. They would have taken shifts standing guard, their warrior culture making them suspicious of rest during dangerous times. They would have maintained their telepathic network through the night, burning energy to stay connected. They would have worked constantly on their burrows, their instincts driving them to dig deeper and deeper. None of them had thought to simply stop, to find a safe place, to close their eyes and let their bodies do what bodies needed to do. Had slept for 12 hours total during the storm. She had woken feeling better than she had felt since arriving on. The other cadets would be exhausted, dehydrated, desperate. She felt fine. The extraction point was visible on the horizon now. It was a flat metal platform with a beacon tower rising from its center, the light blinking steadily against the pale morning sky. She estimated the distance at maybe 15 kilometers, 2 hours of walking at her current pace, maybe less if she pushed herself. But she did not push herself. There was no need. She had time. She had energy. She had learned long ago that the race did not always go to the fastest. Sometimes it went to the one who was still standing at the end. She saw Sir about an hour later. There was ahead of her, maybe 3 kilometers closer to the extraction point. He was moving slowly, his massive body swaying with each step. Even from this distance, could see that something was wrong. His left arm hung at an odd angle. His blue skin looked pale and dry. He was stumbling. Considered her options. She could maintain her current pace and let him reach the extraction point first. He would pass the trial. She would pass the trial. They would both succeed. Or she could speed up, pass him, reach the finish line before he did. It would not change anything about the trial results. Passing was passing. First place meant nothing in the official records, but knew that it would matter to the other cadets. It would matter to the academy instructors. It would matter to everyone who had looked at her and seen a small, fragile human who did not belong among the warriors and telepaths and engineers of the galactic elite. She sped up. Her body protested slightly. Her muscles were not designed for desert travel. Her lungs struggled with the thin, dry air. But she had reserves. She had slept. She had water. She had eaten some of the cactus material during the storm, testing it carefully to make sure it was safe. It had provided enough nutrients to keep her going. She closed the distance between herself and Sir, within 30 minutes. They heard her coming. He turned his head, his yellow eyes widening with surprise. Then the surprise changed to something else. Disbelief, then anger. "Human," he said. His voice was rough and dry. "You survived." "Yes," said. She did not slow down. She passed him, her smaller body moving past his larger one with efficient steps. "How?" Sir demanded. He tried to speed up to match her pace, but his damaged body would not cooperate. He stumbled and nearly fell. "How did you survive? You had nothing. No allies, no abilities, nothing." Did not answer immediately. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on the extraction point ahead. Then she looked back over her shoulder. "I had a knife," she said, "and a cactus." She reached the extraction point 4 hours before Sir. The collapsed as he crossed the finish line. Medical drones descended immediately, scanning his body and administering emergency treatment. He had severe dehydration, multiple burns from lightning exposure, and a fractured arm from a fall during the storm. He would recover, but it would take weeks. Sat on the edge of the metal platform and watched the drones work. She was tired now. The walk had taken more out of her than she had expected, but she was alive. She had passed. She had won. The debriefing took place 3 days later on the orbital station. Stood at attention in the center of a large circular room. Commandant sat behind an elevated desk, her compound eyes studying with an intensity that felt almost physical. Other Academy officials were present as well, representatives from a dozen different species, all watching the human with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism. "Cadet," said. Her voice echoed in the silent room. "You are the only cadet in this year's trial to complete the exercise without significant injury or equipment failure. You are also the first human to pass the sandstorm trial in Academy history." Nodded. She did not speak. She had learned that speaking without being asked was considered rude in most galactic cultures. "Explain your survival strategy," the commandant said. "In detail." Took a breath. "I assessed my resources and my environment. I had limited water, limited shelter materials, and no allies. The other cadets had advantages I did not have: physical strength, telepathic coordination, natural armor. I could not compete with them in those areas, so I looked for other options." The cactus said. "Yes, ma'am. The briefing materials mentioned them but classified them as irrelevant, non-nutritive local flora. I thought that was interesting. The Academy had studied these plants and decided they were not useful for the trial. That meant no one else would consider them." "So you based your strategy on something the Academy had dismissed?" "Yes, ma'am. Humans have a saying, one person's trash is another person's treasure. Sometimes the things that experts ignore are the things that matter most." The commandant's wings twitched. Could not read the gesture, but she thought it might indicate interest. "Continue." The dead cactus provided shelter. Its walls were thick enough to block the wind and sand. Its structure absorbed the electromagnetic interference. I hollowed it out and created a space where I could rest safely. I collected condensation from the living plants nearby. I slept when I needed to sleep. I conserved my energy for the final walk. "You slept," repeated. "During the most dangerous trial the Academy conducts, you slept." "Yes, ma'am. Sleep is not a weakness. It is a recovery mechanism. Humans learned that lesson a long time ago. We are not the strongest species on our planet. We are not the fastest. We do not have claws or fangs or venom. But we survived because we learned to rest when we needed to rest, to think before we act, and to use the environment instead of fighting against it." The room was silent for a long moment. The other officials exchanged glances. One of them, with ceremonial scars on his face, leaned forward. "You are saying that humans conquered their world through laziness?" "No, sir," said. "I am saying we conquered it through efficiency. There is a difference." They made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. Could not tell. Commandant raised one of her forelimbs, silencing the room. "The sandstorm trial was designed to test adaptability and resourcefulness," she said. "Most cadets approach it as a test of endurance. They fight the desert. They resist the storm. They exhaust themselves trying to overcome an environment that cannot be overcome. She looked directly at. You did not fight. You adapted. You found a solution that no one else considered because no one else was willing to look past their own assumptions about what survival means. Did not respond. She was not sure if she was supposed to. The trial briefing materials will be updated next year, the commandant continued. We will include a section on adaptive resource utilization. We will include information about the barrel cacti and their potential uses as emergency shelter. She paused. We will call it the addendum. Felt something warm spread through her chest. Pride, maybe, or just relief, she was not sure. You have passed the trial, said. You have earned your place at this academy. But understand something, cadet. What you did was not a trick. It was not luck. It was the demonstration of a survival instinct that your species has refined over millions of years. That instinct is why humans have spread across the galaxy despite your obvious physical limitations. That instinct is why we accepted your application despite significant opposition from other Academy members. The commandant stood. Do not disappoint us. Saluted. I will do my best, ma'am. She walked out of the debriefing room with her head held high. In the corridor outside, she passed a group of cadets who had failed the trial. They looked at her with expressions she could not read. Respect, maybe, or resentment, or something else entirely. It did not matter. She had survived. She had proven herself. She had taken a knife and a cactus and a willingness to sleep when others refused to rest, and she had turned those simple things into victory. That was what humans did. That was what humans had always done. Find the resources that others ignored. Rest when rest was needed. Adapt to the environment instead of fighting against it. And when the storm finally passed, be the one still standing. Smiled and kept walking.